Hello, this is Matthew Drake. Welcome to the second episode of Nationalist Scorecard. Today we'll be reviewing Sam Harris. Sam, for those who don't know, is a neuroscientist and a self-proclaimed philosopher. He's written several best-selling books, one of which is The End of Faith, which is sort of how he got his start back in the 2000s. Sam Harris is often referred to as one of the four horsemen of New Atheism, a term that was coined back in 2006. Sam, along with Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Daniel Dennett, were all contributors to this kind of grand, mostly online movement that was, after 9/11, was pushing back against religion. And so one of the things that I'll be talking about is how he channels people's aversion to Islam into criticism of religion as a whole. I can certainly say for me, people like Sam were influential in my intellectual and spiritual journey. And I abandoned my faith for many years because of this whole movement. I think when many people think about the new atheists today, the people involved in it are nowhere near as high a caliber as the people who were involved in it back then. And I think those who are talking about atheism today, I sort of question their motives. It seems to me like this issue isn't the most important issue right now, but we still have certain people out there like Sam who are talking about it, and so naturally that brings into question his motives. Perhaps it's not the same motives as others who were interested in atheism back in the day. So I view Sam as very cunning and very dangerous. And the reason I say this is because he does talk about morality, and that is his primary focus. And I'm encouraged to see people talking about morality, but unfortunately, he, I believe, wants to use morality as a tool, a political tool, to achieve his various ends for the world, which have a lot to do with social engineering, and that's something we'll talk about. But yes, I have had an eye on Sam for the past couple of years, and I've listened to maybe 15 to 20 of his podcasts. He has a podcast called the Waking Up Podcast, in which he interviews guest thinkers, most of them being liberal, but sometimes he reaches across the aisle. As I said in the beginning, he kind of is willing to branch out as long as people are, so-called respectable. And we'll get into what that means, right? I will use this opportunity to encourage you to give me money, because I listen to people like Sam so that you don't have to. Believe me, I would rather be consuming other content. I do it for you. So, cough up those shekels, please. Or you can also share the podcast, leave comments, tell your friends about it. This endeavor is really only as good as you all help me make it. So as I was saying, I view Sam as a dangerous character. And why is that? Well, he talks about Islam. So some people on the alt-right, on the civic nationalist side, would say that's a good thing. And in some ways it is. But the problem I see with Sam is that he's very attuned to the situation. Although I would put him in the SJW category, he's not someone who goes out there and is a left-wing radical. And so therefore he appeals to a lot of these, for lack of a better term, boomer conservative types. They're so happy that they have someone on the left who is talking about the rights of gays and the rights of women. And of course, these people aren't real conservatives. This is where our culture is, unfortunately. He's very aware of not overplaying your hand in terms of advancing the liberal cause, and so that's why I say he's one of the most dangerous intellectual figures out there on the left. He cloaks his arguments in his own background and his rational approach to morality, to ideas, and his goal, I think, is to sound smart rather than actually say things that are smart. And this is very effective because a large number of people out there aren't very good at thinking. And he knows this. But a large number of people out there like to think that they're good at thinking. And so along comes this guy who's got a degree in neuroscience, and he's a philosopher, and he is a scientist. And so he can string together sentences which sound very high and lofty. And so you think, well, yeah, this guy is making a lot of sense. He must be right because he's going against the right people, and he's standing up for what is good. And yeah, we can have morality without religion, which I would say perhaps we can, but that's a topic that we can get into later. So I question his motives, and just the first evidence of this is really his delivery, his way of speaking. He will always try to appear as if he's got a handle on everything, and he won't allow his facade to break. He won't allow his emotions to get the better of him. He's almost like a modern-day Spock, right? And that is very intentional. It's designed so that you think he cares extremely about rationality. Perhaps he does care about rationality, but when you point out certain contradictions to him, he's like any other leftist. He will not want to grapple with those. He will want to combat them in a rhetorical way, which makes him appear as if he's got the better hand. But no, this is not somebody that I would trust to be faithful in a debate. That doesn't mean that I wouldn't debate him or that I don't think he's worth debating. I think that someone who is good at debating could do a lot to counter him, especially someone, for instance, Jordan Peterson, who is a Christian but acknowledges certain things about the truth around religion. And of course, there was this big to-do about what is truth, where these guys went at it for several hours on 2 different podcasts and reached some degree of understanding, but not really.
It was certainly the case that the philosophical doctrine to which you adhere has transformed the world and has posed an unbelievably potent threat, let's say. That's one way of challenge, that's better, to traditional views of the world.
I think a good starting point is this. It actually leads directly into this claim about not being Darwinian enough, but it's the concept of truth. I've heard you say in a variety of ways that religious truth isn't scientific truth, and that the difference here is that science tells you what things are, and that religion tells you how you should act. So let's talk about that, and I think that does connect to this Darwinian concern of yours.
Let me jump in then to our first topic, which is open borders. I give Sam Harris a C-. The reason that it's not lower is because he does push back against Islam, but he's doing it because he wants to push back against religion as a whole. I think essentially he doesn't want to just arrive at the truth about religion. I think he wants to bait the Goyim into nihilism. And that is the same with determinism. That's the same with a lot of his arguments. So as I was saying, he'll use his neuroscience degree to gain the trust of people, but he doesn't really have to prove himself in that arena because he has the out of, well, I'm a philosopher, whenever that is most convenient to him. So here's my problem with Sam Harris, and I'm going to read from an article that he has on his website about Trump's travel ban, or as he calls it, Muslim ban. He says, "It is perfectly possible and increasingly necessary to speak about the ideological roots of Islamism and jihadism, and even about the unique need for reform within mainstream Islam itself, without lapsing into bigotry or disregarding the suffering of refugees. Indeed, when one understands the problem for what it is, one realizes that secular Muslims, liberal Muslims, and former Muslims are among the most desirable allies to have in the West. And indeed, such people are the primary victims of Islamist intolerance and jihadist terror in Muslim countries." And if you're familiar with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who I believe was coined at some point the other horsewoman, the fifth horsewoman of atheism. This is a woman who is a secular Muslim, a secular person from that part of the world, from the Middle East, and she goes out and talks about all of the horrors of Islam and how it's not liberal. And a lot of these boomer conservative types eat it up. They really love to hear, oh yes, we don't like Islam, not because we're racist, but because we're pushing back against the real fascists, which is the left. The Dems are the real racists, right? Well, even if we set aside the issue of race, I don't understand why these people would make good allies. For one thing, the fact that they do have this cultural history makes them more susceptible, or at least their children more susceptible, to radicalization. And so if you're just concerned about the violence of radical Islamic terrorism, then there's no reason why you would want to let these people into your country either. You can look up the rates for second-generation Middle Easterners, Islamists. A lot of these people, especially if they go into prisons, they get radicalized, they see propaganda videos. A lot of them don't have the high IQ that I'm sure Ayaan has, and so they're going to be susceptible to these things. And it is not a good idea to say that, oh, these should be our highest allies, right? So there's this idea of suffering, which comes up for Sam quite frequently. And I believe in his book, The Moral Landscape, he talks about that too. And he says suffering should be our primary concern with regards to morality. Now, I would push back heavily against this idea. I believe that property rights should be our primary concern. Suffering, it's much more open to subjectivity, and it's also something that journalists in particular use to manipulate people all around the world, but especially in the West. They show pictures of crying children at the border, or these crying refugees who have been separated from their parents, and it's supposed to tug at your heartstrings, which is just another way of saying get at your wallets and get you to drop all of your defenses. So no, I don't think that we should be concerned about the suffering of people in Africa. I don't think that we should wish for Africans to suffer, but it should certainly not be our primary concern, because how are we going to have an effect, when we're half a world away? How are you going to fix these people's problems? The only way to do it is to be an interventionist, really. It's to be a social engineer. It's to go and make your mission a crusade to help these other parts of the world. It's just not a good idea. It doesn't help our people. And of course, that's perfectly fine with Sam. I would not say that Sam applies his criteria for suffering equally. Does he really care about the white Christian Americans who are suffering because of the effects of multiculturalism? Of course not. Any possible time that this comes up, the opioid crisis or what have you, he will not tie it, he will not lay blame where it belongs, which is diversity, of course. If anything, he will say, I feel for these middle-class people. He would never say white, unless he was talking in a negative way, but these middle-class people, well, I think that this is why we need to give more power to the government, so that we can stimulate the economy and these people can have jobs, of course. And he talked recently with Andrew Yang on his podcast about the issue of universal basic income.
So there's a kind of this barbell picture of very low-end, low-prestige, low-compensation service jobs and super high-end creative jobs that will be most likely spared, certainly in any near-term time frame. But in the middle, you basically have everything from many service jobs and basically any job that has a significantly repetitive routine characteristic. And I think at one point, I think it was McKinsey that said that 73% of food prep jobs can be automated. And the Federal Reserve categorized 44% of all jobs as routine and susceptible to automation.
Yeah, and one of the most shocking things I uncovered in researching for the book was that this is no longer speculative. We're in the middle of it, and we're dealing with it in the worst way possible, which is by ignoring it and pretending it's not happening. Where if you look at our labor force participation rate today, it's down to 62.7%, which is a multi-decade low and the same levels as El Salvador and the Dominican Republic. Our life expectancy has declined for the last 2 years because middle-aged Americans are killing themselves in record numbers, where 7 people die of opiates every hour. And the disability rate is climbing to a point where now there are more Americans on disability than work in construction. When I tried to find out what happened to the manufacturing workers that lost their jobs in the Midwest, it turns out that almost half of them just left the workforce entirely. And then of that group, about half went on disability. So I studied economics in college, and what classical economics says would happen is completely not happening if you actually dig into the numbers and the facts. So this is no longer something we can look ahead to and say, what are we going to do? This is ripping our society apart. The reason why Donald Trump is our president today is because of the spreading dysfunction. And right now, the country's locked in a struggle between functioning and dysfunction, reason and unreason, and scarcity and abundance. And scarcity is winning. And that's what we have to reverse through universal basic income. It's our best way forward.
I believe that Andrew has announced he's running for president in 2020 on the platform of a universal basic income. This is basically a welfare state, but without any hoops. You don't have to do anything to claim your, quote, free money, because everyone under a UBI system will be given a very basic level. And it doesn't take too much thinking to rebut this, of course. If you make a precedent for this, every politician in the future is going to have to run on increasing the amount of universal basic income, because that will ensure that that person gets more votes. And especially in a multicultural society, whatever you think of capitalism as a system, I think we can agree that socialism is even more disastrous in a multicultural environment, because these are the groups that will use the welfare the most. They're not going to have investment. Nobody's going to have investment in the country because it doesn't really belong to any group. It's going to be one group against the other, except for whites, who will be coaxed into individualism. And this is the plan, because the whites are the primary tax producers, the primary wealth creators, and so they will try to there's no such thing as basic income. No, this is theft. It's redistribution. Another thing about the multiculturalism thing is that studies show when you mention race, white people get more right-wing. When you talk about race in terms of welfare usage, which groups are using the most welfare? We all know what the answer to that is. Well, studies actually show that the average person, and by that I mean white people, move more towards the right by all measures. Not just nationalism, not just immigration, but actually they move right on welfare, and they move right on social issues as well. With regards to that particular podcast, this is another demonstration of why Sam is so dangerous, because he understands where the current left in the U.S. is going wrong. And it's that they thought they had won. They're pushing too hard on the racial thing, and whites are getting turned off and going towards the right, towards the far right even. And so if Democrats want to have any hope of pushing things, pushing the demographic decline even further and even faster than it is going under Trump, they're going to have to get smarter. And people like Sam Harris have the right strategy, I believe, which is don't talk about race. Go back to the class issue. Go back to talking about wages and things that your average white American will care about. Things like automation and AI. You can stir up a lot of anxiety among the population by talking about these things, even though there are rebuttals for them. Ultimately, we'll see how this UBI thing goes. I think that most people will understand the basic arguments that, okay, like changes have happened before, revolutions, industrialization has happened before, and everyone was fine, right? And of course, Sam Harris and this Andrew person want to dispel that idea. They want to say, this time it's different. Just like they want to say, this time socialism or this time democratic liberalism is going to work. I think we have reason to be fearful, to take seriously people like Sam Harris who are more on the center of things in the political spectrum. People like Dave Rubin, who Sam talks to fairly regularly, I think. These are all people who, they look and they say, oh, the left is just crazy right now. We need to go back to a time of sanity among the left. Well, I hate to break it to you guys, but they wouldn't be saying that if the radical left was succeeding. If Donald Trump hadn't got elected, I don't think these people would be talking in this way. Because they want the same things as the radical left. They just want to get there at a slower rate because they're worried that if things keep going, there will be a backlash, like we're seeing in places like Italy, like we're seeing with Brexit, like we're seeing with the election of Trump. And this allows your average white person to say, hey, I'm not racist. I just care about the economy, right? I think we can all get along. So it taps into this cultural idea that's embedded into all politically acceptable conversations. Which is a perfect segue into our next point. Opposing cultural Marxism. I give Sam a D+ for this. I do think that Sam is at heart an SJW, a social justice warrior. Of course, he doesn't get an F because he pushes back against the idea that everyone is equal from birth. One of the quotes on his website is, he's quoted as having said, "Some ideas really are worse than others. And the idea that all religions, cultures, and belief systems are equal is one of the worst of them all." So this is posted on a little meme that somebody made, and of course it's got a picture of a white person with kind of swippily glasses, who's dressed in a Nazi brown shirt uniform, and instead of the Hitler mustache, it's got an equal sign. So this is, again, the idea, liberals of today, radical left, they are the real fascists. But subtly, he's implying that fascism and Nazism, National Socialism, they're all just as bad as, in fact, worse. He'd probably say they're worse than the SJWs. But they're similar enough that he can equate them. So yes, he does say that not all cultures are equal. Notice that he didn't mention race in that list. Religions, cultures, belief systems are not equal. He didn't say race. That would be a little too edgy. So he does make this admission, but he seems to think that we should treat people as if they're equal anyway. And this comes from another meme on his podcast, where he says, "We will embarrass our descendants just as our ancestors embarrass us. This is moral progress." So obviously, what he's talking about here is progressivism. He's talking about, hey, we're going to, quote, move this moral needle forward and advance society. Just like we got rid of slavery, we're going to get rid of racism. We're going to get rid of any injustices that impede on the ability for people to act as free human beings. It's the usual lefty stuff where they talk about women, gays, and apostates as the main victims of Islamization. He's not talking about women like he wants to liberate them from their abusive husbands so that they can enter into like happy voluntary marriages. No, he's talking about it being okay for women to be sexually free. He talks about it should be okay for a man to be openly gay. It should be okay for people to denounce religion entirely and to form this nihilism around them in which it sucks their life. Now, of course, you might say, oh, you're creating a straw man. He doesn't want those things. He just wants freedom. And, I would say I don't think it's a good thing that women are stoned to death in these cultures just for having an affair. But I would say that there need to be consequences for these actions. And I don't like the fact that we allow the state to do it. You see, Sam has no problem with the state taking punitive action if it's for a cause that he agrees with. Sexual liberation of women destroys civilization. Allowing homosexuality to spread and eventually be accepted and people to promote this actively and to even then groom young people broaching on pedophilia. This kind of stuff also, like I said, with nihilism, people rejecting any kind of higher purpose, any kind of contribution to their society, that they feel like they have a connection with people. All of these things destroy civilization if they're allowed to spread. And I think Sam knows that very well. He wants there to be no standards for society because then he knows it will not be able to maintain itself and it's easier to dismantle that society. And that is where I think Sam's real motivations lie. This isn't just about human rights. So you might ask, well, how do you know? How do you know that he's not really just interested in freedom? Well, I know because he's not talking about replacing religion with anything. Yeah, he has some vague idea of science and progress and morality, but fundamentally, he does not have a solution for restricting the freedom of women to be sexually liberal. He does not have a solution for nihilism. He does not have a solution for things like homosexuality, which lead to greater abominations such as transgenderism and pedophilia. That's how I know that his motives are not good. And this has been a problem for philosophers for centuries, where they are very good at being critical. They're not good at establishing a system which will be a positive force in society and advance that society and the children of that current population. Again, Sam defines morality as whatever reduces suffering for the most number of people. But the problem is, how is he able to define suffering? He denies anything like a soul, so he's only able to focus on physical suffering. Any kind of existential suffering, therefore, is irrelevant to Sam. And this is, I think, what a lot of people like Jordan Peterson, even Russell Brand, who Sam talked with, are getting at when they criticize Sam, because he's not able to address this existential crisis which is happening in our society, largely due to things like new atheism. So Sam does not differentiate between the suffering brought about by injustice and the suffering brought about because of something that the person who is suffering has done himself. And a lot of people will say, oh, you're victim blaming. I don't know if I am, especially if you're talking about large groups of people, complicated issues like politics. Yes, a lot of people are forced to accept the norms of the Islamist culture in the Middle East. But how are you going to determine if they have responsibility for this? How are you going to determine if you got rid of Islam that they wouldn't just cling to something similar to it or something far worse than it? And again, I'm not trying to defend Islam. I don't think it's something that's ultimately a healthy and productive thing for the world as a whole. But it's kind of not my problem. And I think also when we talk about things like the poor, right? A lot of people want to say, well, the poor are helpless because they've been subjected. All of these capitalists are exploiting the workers. We don't ever want to look at the possibility that maybe people are poor because of their own doing, because of irresponsible decisions, family life, which is somewhat chosen and somewhat not, depending on where you are in your life. You know, this idea, where do we assign responsibility? It's a tricky thing to figure out. And then finally, I'll point out, while I'm on the cultural Marxism topic, I'll point out that it's contradictory, really, to come out against tribalism, which is what Sam does. He's against tribalism, at least insofar as the people he's talking to. He makes a point to say that this is not good and that we should be rational, free-thinking individuals. Well, I believe rational free thinking, absolutely. But individualism can be harmful when we take it to an extreme. And it seems contradictory to me to say that tribalism is bad, but we have a collective responsibility to help those who are weaker and suffering. You know, this doesn't jive to me. If I'm an individual, why shouldn't I? You know, forget about the religion thing. Why shouldn't I just do what's best for me? And he would say, well, that's other people will suffer because of that. But that's just objectively not true. You know, there might be some people who suffer in your instance. But if our philosophy is capitalistic, this is going back to Ayn Rand's virtue of selfishness. If everyone is doing what they're doing, why is that going to increase suffering? Actually, if you look at systems of capitalism, it's lifted the most people out of poverty. And so this idea that, well, we have an obligation to help those who are weaker and so on, I don't think that you necessarily do. I think there are some obligations to your society which you want to find a purpose, and that purpose often involves thinking about others' besides yourself. And I think for that reason, we will be very unhappy if we aren't out there doing good in the world. But Sam's idea is sort of to beat people over the head with this notion and to say, well, we're not doing enough to help those who are weaker. But, weaker does not necessarily mean good-natured. As I said before, there can be lots of evil, weak, disadvantaged people, so to speak. So I think you can't just look at it as this very simplistic liberal idea of the underdog being the hero, the champion, or whatever, and it's our job to lift that person up. No, it's our job to speak truth to power, absolutely, but who these people think have the power, it's a bit misplaced. So now I'll move on to free speech, and I give Sam a B- for this. There was a very interesting exchange in his interview on Russell Brand's podcast. They were talking about Islam and jihadists, and Russell Brand made the point that, in a sense, you do kind of live on after you die if you make an impact on the world, right? And so it's not exactly fair to say that these suicide bombers had a completely wrong idea when they said, oh, they're going to go to paradise and get 72 virgins for their actions. Sam Harris replied, most people do believe that you actually go somewhere after you die.
I don't know. I think, again, that I wouldn't deliberately misread the metaphor. For me, life after death, and this is a person that spent 2 years in a silent retreat, I would gather you would dig this, is that beyond the life that is determined by primal desires and biographical wants and your imagination of yourself, there is a life after the death of that individual. After that individual dies and you recognise that the temporal can never provide fulfilment, you gain access to a sort of a second life, an afterlife. The kingdom of heaven is spread upon the earth and man sees it not. The kingdom of heaven.
Are you talking about the life after the death of your ego?
I suppose so, Sam. Yes, I would say if it's not talking about that, I don't know what it's talking about. And what the value of that would be.
But that's fine. But
as a manual for being human. Also, Sam, there's so much, mate. Let me hold on a sec. So we've got to go through. You did a big classification system of the degrees of who's the worst madman.
I just want to put a flag right here.
We've got to do the schools.
Okay, well, we'll do that.
Do your flag, and then we're going back to the schools.
I just want to acknowledge that whatever
personal reading,
whatever your reading is, most people, most of the time, think that the afterlife is a literal place you go after you die. That consciousness survives the death of the body. And in the Judeo-Christian tradition,
I know,
especially the Christian,
mate.
and the Islamic tradition, it really matters whether you believe the right thing or not. In fact, this life doesn't matter at all, and that's what's so corrosive about this.
So this is kind of getting to that truth idea. What do you mean by truth, as Jordan Peterson says? And in a narrow sense, it's true. The religion is built on a lie. Yes, I agree. But the question that is more fundamental is, if you remove the lie from religion, is there anything left? And I think that Sam would say, no, there's really nothing left that's worth saving, right? And so a lot of people who are religious, they are followers in life. They're not interested in these philosophical questions, to be honest. They're doing it for other reasons, and I don't think that lying is good. I don't think living by a lie is a just way to live. It's not ideal by any means, right? But I think you have to understand what these people are actually doing. It doesn't mean just because they're doing something based on a lie that thing doesn't have a huge, enormous effect. Is a lie necessary for collective action? For unification of a, say, ethnic group or religious group to band together? I would say it's not, right? I would say that a lot of other things about religion, like rituals and myths and all of these things. And Sam will kind of admit this to some degree, like, okay, there might be some benefit, but he always comes back to, why can't we have those things without religion? Maybe we can. But if you're going to say, why can't we have those things without religion, it's, as I said, very good to have something to back up and show as proof that we can have those things. Because science isn't going to cut it. Science isn't going to hold our civilization together. As we've seen, the left frequently uses science as a battering ram. Global warming and everything. So 97% of scientists agree. And so science, while I'm all in favor of scientific advancement, it has to be real advancement and not this phony government-aided advancement of science. So why do I say that Sam is somewhat good on the free speech issue? Well, he does push back against politically incorrect things, and he would probably admit that he supports free speech. I don't think he's ever said we shouldn't have free speech. He probably would say there's certain limitations on free speech, like yelling fire or something. It's the very basic argument for free speech. Now, what's interesting and kind of why his grade is B- instead of like a B+, Sam has said there are only two modes, conversation and violence. And if we stop talking, then we start fighting. And I would say, okay, I understand what you're saying, but I would tweak that. I would actually say there are 4 modes. Okay, there's honest conversation. There's dishonest conversation. So the honest conversation is two people in search of the truth, right? Dishonest conversation is where one or more of the people is not in search of the truth. And we often call this propaganda. There's also indirect violence, which would be like threats or coercion. Often this is comes in the form of government force. And then there's also direct violence, which is the idea of the revolution, skirmishes, conflicts, wars, etc. Now, obviously, honest conversation is good, and direct violence is bad, or at least we would like to avoid those things. I think across the board, most people want to avoid the violence because it's risky. You could very well be injured. But what about the other two? Sam does not mention those other forms of soft power. That's probably because, for one, he and his ilk are the ones engaging in these forms of soft power. And also, I think it's because they know that they're not very good at direct violence. So if there was an EMP and everything, all the power went out and there was a race war or something, Sam probably isn't going to be, he's not going to fare so well unless he has guards around him. We'll get to the alien question, which is coming up at the last segment. I've got a pretty good analogy that I can give. But yeah, Sam is kind of this alien figure, and he knows that he wouldn't do very well in a completely homogenous white culture. That's why he has to use these more soft power approaches, these manipulations, these essentially using lies and arguing in bad faith as a weapon against people who aren't able to see through those tactics. And in that regard, we talk about sociopaths, and sociopaths are people who lack empathy. I really do think that a lot of people who are in media, a lot of the left-wing journalists and such, would fall into this category because they don't demonstrate any form of empathy for their audience. And the way that you can kind of tell is that they are able to assume any role in order to achieve their agenda. And I think that if you look at Sam in particular, he's pretty good at doing this, right? He's good at sort of defending things, even when it would seem to contradict with something else he would say, right? So is Sam a sociopath? I don't know if I'm willing to go that far, but it's something to take into consideration, because oftentimes when people don't have empathy, that means that they're better at shape-shifting, right? They're better able to be actors because they can just easily jump into any other kind of skin that they want. And there's something really distasteful, there's something that kind of creeps you out once you see this thing happening, right? Because they're able to make you think that they're empathizing, but they're actually not. Okay, so condemned by elite. I give Sam Harris a C. Sam, he markets himself as a renegade, but is he? Well, of course, we had this whole intellectual dark web article in the New York Times, and I believe Sam was one of the foremost people in that group, and it's just kind of funny to me, like, Sam's been around for a long time. Why are they putting him into the intellectual dark web? Well, as Rubin would say, it's because the left left him, right? What the mainstream media, the New York Times, views as the norm in the country, even though, they're living in their own bubble, they don't really know what the norm is. They think that they've gone off in the society's gone off in this other direction, like absolute social justice and oppression Olympics, white people are evil. I've talked before about how the intellectual dark web is a farce, and it's really just the other side of a sandwich, which Sam's tribe would find acceptable. On the one hand, he seems like he's condemned by the elite. The elite wants you to think that he's condemned by the elite so that he has this edginess to him. But what he does is he'll say, I won't talk to Stefan Molyneux because he had Jared Taylor on his podcast. But as if that's not bad enough, he says, I won't talk to Douglas Murray because, and I think this has changed probably, but at one time I remember him saying, I won't talk to Douglas Murray because he talked to Stefan Molyneux, and Stefan Molyneux talked to Jared Taylor, and so by association, I guess Douglas Murray's a Nazi or something. So this is how he views toxicity, right? It's this hypersensitivity, that extreme right wing that he's so fearful of, and a lot of people like him are. Yeah, we'll get to that. That itself does not mean he's against free speech, but I do think it kind of shows you that he's definitely not a pariah, right? The elite very much want Sam Harris to debate people who are acceptable. That's how you know that he's not really this big edgelord just because he speaks out against Islam, is because he still gets invited to debates. And these debates are largely staged in order to influence public opinion. And that is how I see Sam Harris. So let me also talk about the free will debate here for a moment. This is another one of those conversations which is meant to hold people hostage to an argument or an idea, get them caught up, right? People who are really intelligent, but maybe not the most socially aware and most focused people. This can really get them caught up in thinking, is what I'm doing determined? Has everything been predestined? And I know that Stefan Molyneux has talked about this. It's just, after a while, it's sort of pointless. You can go back and forth forever, but I see why this idea can be popular to people. We do have animal brain. We are animals ourselves, and we have sort of these deeper, baser instincts like the lizard brain, the monkey brain, and so it often seems like we don't have control over what we're doing. But this is largely because we've fallen into habits, and perhaps you could say there are ruts that our brain gets carved into. But that doesn't mean that we're not able to climb out of those ruts. It's just that if you stay in a rut for longer, it becomes harder and harder to get out of it. I don't believe that anybody ever is completely beyond the ability to change, or I don't think anything's completely determined, but I do think that certain people, after they've done enough bad in their life, you just know they're not going to change, because it would be too high of a mountain, too tall of an order for them to get out of that mindset, because their decisions in the past have sort of trapped them. That doesn't mean we don't have free will. And of course, it doesn't take a neuroscientist to see that there's no possibility for morality if people can't make choices freely. I think the motivation of Sam is that he's trying to start from a position of social engineering, where he has an agenda for the world. And if human thinking isn't just an algorithm, then there's no way you can tinker with that and get predictable results. And so for someone like him, I think that's very frightening to think that, oh, despite all of this programming that the leftist media, the globalists have imposed on Western civilization, there's still people who are breaking out of it. There's still people who are resisting and ironically waking up. He doesn't want that to be the case. He wants you to just think that everything is preordained. Another one of these conversations that he talks about that I think is meant to trip you up and get you to not take any action that matters in the world, like pushing back against immigration policy, etc., taking pride in your people, trying to fight for something that matters. I think another one of these is drugs and psychedelics. He talks about them not just from a policy point, but with such appreciation. He implies that he and others like him would never have felt a profound or spiritual experience unless they took ayahuasca. I think this perspective, well, it's quite sad. It's sad that your life sucks so much that you need drugs in order to feel profound experiences. And I believe that this is probably true for him. I don't think that when he talks about his personal experiences, that he's lying in any way, that he had these spiritual experiences while on psychedelics. But, he's just talking about self-knowledge, but he's talking about it at a very superficial level. He doesn't get into the things that shape and form a person, such as early childhood experiences, right? Those things don't come into play. It's just, well, we are who we are. We're sort of fully formed, and if we take drugs, we can open ourselves up and we can be more, we can fill the void. He would never say that we should fall into addiction, but he says that, taking these things once or twice, it can really open you up, man. He doesn't use the word man, but it can make you more tolerant. It's not that it's making you more tolerant, it's that it's making you more nihilistic. It's making it so that you're willing to put up with more. It numbs you to the things that you should be caring about, right? And it makes that pain, the pain that is supposed to prompt us into action, that's why we have pain, it numbs that. And so that numbing thing can be very addictive to people. Even once you experience it once, I'm not saying you should never ever take drugs or anything, but I'm skeptical of it. I would say you should try to find other ways to heal from that pain and other ways to open yourself up while not taking away the emotions which are natural and, creating this diversion from where the real source is coming from, which is the problems in the world. Multiculturalism, globalization, bad parenting, all of these things which are much, much deeper than just AI or robotics or all of these things. I just think that Sam talks at a very superficial level, and that's another reason why he's not condemned by the elite as much as a lot of the people who are actually fighting for Western civilization and fighting for a future, fighting for goodness. Okay, so pro-white, pro-Western. Sam did this interview with Christian Piccolini, who is, supposedly this former neo-Nazi. I just thought that this was a lesson in top-notch projection, right? So Piccolini, I don't know, he could be an actor, but I think at the very least he's probably being coached. So the story is like he was in this violent neo-Nazi gang in the 80s and stuff, and he somehow found his way out, and he is trotted out by a lot of the intellectual class, like Sam Harris, in order to discredit the alt-right, in order just to discredit anyone who's in favor of ethnic nationalism.
So there are analogous situations in the white nationalist or white power movement where you've been indoctrinated into something that's like white identity politics, for lack of a better word, just pride in your whiteness and not liking affirmative action, say. Yeah. And you might not even be self-consciously a racist.
So why do I say this is projection? Why do I think that projection is a prominent tactic, whether conscious or not, by those who are anti-white? Well, I think it's because if you can get the jump on your enemy and accuse your enemy of doing what you are doing, then you have the advantage of being first. If you accuse someone of a crime and then they come back and say, no, you're the one doing this crime, then that person just kind of looks unoriginal. Other people are going to look at that and think, the least you could do is come up with a better comeback, right? So they're going to look at that skeptically, and that's why projection works so well. And Piccolini was doing this in the interview. He said, white nationalism is a social movement. It's not about ideology. So this idea that, they're just getting young people to buy into this. People don't actually care about the ideas at all. Well, that's just a way of not dealing with the ideas. But this is exactly the tactic that progressives use. Insofar that progressives, they like progressivism because it allows them to virtue signal. They don't actually care that much about the ideas. They're just sort of in it because it's a social clique. So I think that's a very fair thing to say. Piccolini, he'll say alt-right, the white nationalists, they've evolved, they've moved into more intellectual spheres, but it's just a way to disguise their real violent intentions.
At first, it wasn't a conscious plan to go under the radar. At first, it was very much like a cult where you detach yourself from everything that was important in your life. Your friends, your family, your hobbies, and you go down a rabbit hole of information, misinformation, and conspiracy theory that becomes your reality. And I can tell you that 30 years ago, we recognized exactly what you're saying, that we were a small group that was too visible. And we said, these average American white racists who we want to recruit are getting turned off by the fact that we have swastikas on our foreheads, right? Or we have boots or shaved heads, and we're talking, very, much about foreign kind of politics and, National Socialism. So we made a very concerted effort 30 years ago to normalize. We said we're going to ditch the shaved heads and the Klan robes, and that's still around, but for the most part not. And we're going to trade in our boots for suits. We're going to go to college campuses to recruit where people are away from their families for the first time, are forming new opinions, may feel marginalized. We're going to get jobs in law enforcement. We're going to go to the military and get training, and we're going to run for office. And that's around the time that we see David Duke kind of get rid of the robe and wear the suit. And here we are 30 years later, and it's very much that is the representation of the white supremacist movement that we're seeing today.
And of course, this is also a projection, I believe. You just have to look at how the media treats Antifa, right? They don't openly come out and condemn them. It's because secretly they want that side to win, and they're not afraid to use violence if they have to, but they know that that's not a popular position, so they're not going to come out and say it. So yeah, just a lot of these things about projection. It's very good to look out for this stuff. But yeah, Sam, there's no way that he is interested in the future of white people, the future of Western people. He wants a place that is going to be comfortable for him to live. That is not the same thing as what white people want. So of course, he has to talk about this, just this bigotry, and he never actually addresses any of the arguments. All he will ever say is he'll just sort of shake his head and just say, well, we don't even have to address this because it's just so horrendous. It's just so obviously horrendous. And that's just a convenient way for him to deal with it. And he doesn't have to actually debate Richard Spencer or anyone on the alt-right. Finally, naming you-know-who. Forgot to give you the grade. So pro-white is an F. He also fails the you-know-who test. That's an F. Now, of course, the only time that Sam will come out and criticize his tribe, I'll leave it to you to figure out what I'm talking about, is when he's talking about religion as a whole. He would probably say that a particular religion is at the top of the hierarchy, maybe below Buddhism. He really likes Buddhism. Yeah, I think largely the only time that he'll come out and talk about this tribe is when he's saying, well, when he's using scare tactics about nationalism, saying, oh, could lead to another Holocaust, and we can never let that happen. So I want to give you an analogy, right, just for people who haven't heard too much about this idea. I want you to imagine if you were an alien sent to another planet, and you had technology that would help you blend in with the population on that planet. And your mission is really just to survive on the planet without being found out. Because, if they find out about you, there's a chance that they might kill you. So you're much weaker physically than the natives, but you're very skilled verbally. So I want you to imagine this situation. I want you to imagine what your strategy would be for surviving on this planet. You probably wouldn't want to become some great political leader, because then you would stand out and you'd be a target. You might get killed. However, you would want to be someone who had an influence in the society, mainly behind the scenes. You'd also probably sow nihilism and propagate the idea of tolerance in the society. That way, if you were found out, you'd be more likely to survive. You would also prefer to talk with other aliens who are like you, but you would make sure that you would argue over minor discrepancies, and that way nobody would accuse you of colluding together. If you're talking with somebody disagreeing from the outset, then most people will say, oh, well, you're not really on the same side, but you're not talking about the things that you have in common. You're just talking about your differences. And those are minor in the grand scheme of things of what is concerning the larger population. Now, when you're arguing with this other alien, you would know that you're both aliens, but you would want to talk in a way that nobody realized you were both aliens. And so you might talk about the values of the native population, such as tolerance and liberal values and freedom for gays and lesbians and trannies and this type of thing. All of the other kinds of misfits, you would promote them. You would prop them up, and you would also speak out against the groups who were, seen as bullies. Really just the groups who were standing up for themselves. But in any group who could kind of have a backbone, you would want to discredit them. You would want to say, well, no, these people, they build their ideology on a lie, and we should not buy into their rhetoric. This is a very dangerous superstition. And so that's a way of discrediting these so-called bullies, people who have a spine, anyone who might be able to push back against your agenda, your ideology, your alienness, and might be able to call you out. You want people who are weak and in despair and hopeless, and that way they will never, ever cast their eyes upon you. And this is the role of Sam Harris and those intellectuals like him. They aren't like you and me, and they aren't debating in good faith. So overall, my grade for Sam is a D+. And I'll just wrap it up by saying that Sam Harris's goal isn't about waking people up. It's exactly the opposite. His goal is to keep smart, motivated people, many times white, asleep, so that they can't ever think about rising up and resisting the shackles that are closing in around them by the people who control things behind the scenes. He wants a deracinated class of serfs that can be experimented on and socially engineered so that people like him will assume the role of the ruling elite. Thank you very much for listening. Please check out my website. It's illustratedphilosophy.com. There's a donate tab over there if you want to help out what I'm doing. And I usually post these episodes up there. You can check out all my other work. please leave me comments and let me know what kinds of things you'd like to see from the channel. I look forward to the next one of these. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day.